You're watching Force 13's live streaming service.
Good morning if you are watching this from the Philippines, or good afternoon if you are watching this from the US. We are covering two tropical cyclones mainly today, or wherever you are. We are covering Tropical Storm Zeta in the Atlantic, which has sparked hurricane warnings for a portion of the Yucatan Peninsula once again. We are also monitoring Typhoon... what is it? I forget its name at the top of my head. Molave, thank you. That is approaching the Philippines, or I should say impacting the Philippines at this time, and is quite a significant threat to Vietnam, as they have received several inches of rainfall from past tropical cyclones over the past few days. I'm joined by my live team consisting of Christian, Codemo, Nelson, Jacob, Kay, Strat, Thomas. How are you all doing this afternoon?
I'm pretty good.
Pretty good.
Quite alright.
Alright, let's get down to the latest around the world. We'll go with Tropical Storm Zeta, as it is quite the most significant threat currently in the Atlantic. It has sparked hurricane warnings. As of the most recent National Hurricane Center advisory, the government of Mexico has issued a hurricane warning for the Yucatan Peninsula from Tulum to Rio Largatos, including Cozumel. And in addition to that, there's also a tropical storm warning, which remains in effect for portions of Cuba for Pinar del Rio in Cuba. Now, looking over towards the north a little bit, I'll try to move the imagery up here if you can see it. We've got the absolute disgrace of a system up here, I guess you could say. That is Epsilon, which is forecast to be post-tropical over the next few hours. Thomas, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, Epsilon's going to be making its post-tropical transition here in short order. The reality is, it's going to be a serious threat for the United Kingdom, and it's also going to be a relatively serious threat for Iceland as well. Tropical storm force winds can be expected up to 70 miles per hour sustained for any areas really within there. We still have some uncertainty with how exactly it's going to interact with the secondary low pressure system it will also be dealing with. It's coming in from around Atlantic Canada. So definitely complicated situation, but if you're up in the United Kingdom, I'd be watching this.
Definitely.
Yep, I'll be keeping an eye out as well since I'm in the UK.
Now, Christian, since you are in the UK, what are your local meteorological services over there? What are they forecasting
The Met Office.
impact-wise from Epsilon, if anything at all?
Oh God, I actually haven't checked. Let me see if I can just briefly check the Met Office and see what they're forecasting. I don't know. I can only go up to tomorrow, so that's not helpful.
Currently, there are no UK weather warnings in force.
Yeah.
But they don't tend to do warnings beyond 3 days, and I don't believe it's going to be here within 3 days at the moment. So.
Yeah. Okay.
But beyond Scotland, they're not expecting significant or abnormal impacts this time of year. It's going to be more towards Iceland that they get more unusual weather, shall we say.
I guess you could say that, absolutely. If you do have any comments or questions with us this afternoon, please do send them in the comment section below. We have already received some. This first hour, we'll mainly be focusing on Zeta and Epsilon, and we'll be getting to Malave in the second hour, where there are Signal 3, 2, and 1 warnings in effect for the Philippines. Now, regarding Zeta, regarding our team members here, I just have a question for all of you. Do we think that it will get to hurricane status in the Gulf of Mexico?
It's very much looking like it. It's improved quite well. And as the season always has been, improved better than the original models were showing. And now the current models are suggesting that it's going to become a hurricane even before hitting the Yucatan and stay as so until it hits Louisiana.
Absolutely. I know that Thomas, in particular, made a forecast cone earlier today. I believe that you were forecasting a 90-mile-per-hour peak prior to making landfall on the Yucatan Peninsula.
Yeah, I mean, a 90-mile-per-hour landfall is forecasted with this because, well, it's going to be intensifying quickly. It's been intensifying faster than initially expected. And I'm expecting that to continue. And I think there's an argument to be made for a Category 2 as well, being a possibility.
Well, in terms of what's possible, it depends on how quickly it organizes itself, and if it rapidly intensifies, how much will it intensify? It's got 30 hours in the Caribbean before it makes landfall on or near Cozumel, and in that time it could definitely get to Category 3, possibly Category 4 if it goes towards the upper end of what's possible in the basin. But obviously, we're not anticipating that at this time. The models aren't really going for a major. So we're expecting a 90-mile-an-hour peak, but anything's possible, as Delta showed us earlier this month.
Now, I know that the National Hurricane Center are going much lower than what we're going with. They're running with 75 last I can recall. I'm not sure if that's changed or not, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is at the moment. The biggest question regarding Zeta in its intermediate phase, I guess you could say, is just how much it's going to organize prior to making landfall in the Yucatan. It's got plenty of sea surface temperatures. Sea surface temperatures are really favorable all throughout the Western Caribbean Sea, regardless of where the storm goes. But the big question is when it gets into the Gulf of Mexico. Wind shear is going to increase a little bit, and it'll probably increase dramatically as it gets closer to land. So while the National Hurricane Center does indeed forecast a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, this will probably make landfall in the U.S. as a tropical storm.
Yeah,
Now,
and I mean, that's reflected in their forecast pretty well. Both the lack of certainty with the exact peak potential as it crosses the Yucatan and enters the Gulf of Mexico, and that weakening due to shear.
Now, Thomas, I can see on your screen here that you are showing up your forecast cone and your main hazards. Do you want to go about those a little bit?
So this cone in particular really does represent at least my thinking And I know that Kay, who's in here as well, really helped me out with this cone as well. I think both of us are thinking very similarly here. A 90-mile-per-hour peak was chosen before landfall in the Yucatan Peninsula. The storm looks like it's really getting its act together right now, and it looks like that center relocation is nearly complete, and the storm's been deepening very quickly, to say the least. So I think the expectation of a hurricane within the next day or so is perfectly reasonable. And again, a Category 2 landfall into the Yucatan is possible. After that, the storm's probably going to get disrupted by the Yucatan. And as it moves into the Gulf of Mexico, I'm expecting little change in strength for a couple of days. Sea surface temperatures will be quite good. When it comes to the humidity, the dry air, it's going to be pretty decent. I mean, it's not going to be fantastic, but it's not going to be awful either. And wind shear is going to start to rise dramatically, and that's why weakening is anticipated. By the time we do get to the landfall point, a 70-mile-per-hour landfall is expected right now just to the east of New Orleans, near between New Orleans and Pensacola there. So that's the expectation. And after that, around 4 days out, we expect a tropical depression inland. So that's generally what we're expecting there. As we do head to the key messages associated with this, big things I wanted to drive home. You're going to probably receive hurricane conditions if you're somewhere along the northern Yucatan Peninsula. At least some area is going to experience hurricane conditions, and a widespread area will experience tropical storm conditions. If you're in the red area within this key messages graphic, you are under the area that I think has the highest chance of receiving hurricane conditions. If you're in that orangish area, I think you have a fair chance of experiencing tropical storm conditions. And if you're anywhere within the yellow area, this is where things like heavy rainfall can affect you. Still some higher surf can affect you, but the highest storm surge, the highest wind speeds, that's all going to be within that red and orange area that I have noted there. Something else to note is that Zeta will be a borderline hurricane as it does arrive along the United States coast. And that should be noted because regardless of whether it is at hurricane status or not, the impacts will be very similar. So prepare for this as if you're preparing for a Category 1 hurricane.
Now, I just want to think about this for a little bit, Thomas. When we're looking at Zeta here and its U.S. landfall predicted intensity of 70 miles per hour, is there really any storm that residents along this coastline could relate to when it comes to Zeta making landfall there?
Comes to particular storms that this is kind of similar to, I mean, I'm not great on climatology, but what I can say is that this will be hitting areas. I think that the main area that this is going to be hitting is very similar to where Sally hit earlier this year. That's going to be the general landfall zone that we're going to be getting to. When it comes to a storm that forms in the Western Caribbean, heads into this general direction, the only other general analog that I can think of off the top of my head from recently is mudfall. Obviously, we're not going to be getting anything anywhere near as strong as that, but when it comes to track, it could be something similar. So I don't know what the rest of the team's thoughts are on that.
Comparison could be made to Nate of 2017.
Yeah, that'd probably be a good one because even though this is coming in not due north, it's going to be initially moving into the Gulf of Mexico, going northwest and then hooking to the north-northeast before making landfall either in eastern Louisiana or in Mississippi, Alabama, or the far western Florida panhandle. Its forward speed and general looser structure at its final approach to land will be pretty similar, and it will be accelerating in forward speed as it comes into land as well. We're looking at a day 3 point just onshore maybe, or barely offshore of a landfall location, and then day 4, this could be all the way up in Kentucky or Ohio. So that's a really good analogy for it.
That is actually a really good analog. And when it comes to Zeta's rainfall, what are we forecasting for that?
I believe it was around 8 inches in the Yucatan. And it's still uncertain at this point for the Gulf Coast because timing is everything. And it's a very complex scenario that's going to be causing its steering as it approaches the Gulf Coast. But I'd say at this point, 4 to 8 inches is possible in isolated areas.
Yeah, you know, the GFS is calling for along the northeastern Yucatan Peninsula near Cancun, up to 8 inches right now, and then along the Gulf Coast potentially a range of 4 to 8, but a bit more on the lower end just because the storm's going to be moving so quickly. You could actually see the highest rainfall totals several hundred miles inland of the United States compared to coastal areas with this system. And that doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen, so keep that in mind if you're watching this system.
Yeah. It's really just something to watch. If you're in the U.S., keep an eye on it. If you're in the Yucatan, start preparing. I think is the best thing I can say right now.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, if you're in the United States, please do prepare for something of this nature. You know, I mean,
3 days out at this time.
What? I'm sorry?
It's 3 days out at this time. It should be important to give time frames. So you've got 2 full days to prepare before you might start feeling the earliest impacts. If you're on the coast.
I think it's just something that's like, if you're in the areas of Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama, prepare, especially Louisiana, where it looks like the main landfall will be. Definitely keep an eye, prepare, have things prepared, prepare as you would any other system, and keep an eye.
Let's put it up just for a second. I know a lot of people are talking about it in chat. Our host will return shortly, and we will start having other data up on the screen here in short order. Just bear with us. But what you can see, I do have a rainfall graphic pulled up, and now we do have some infrared imagery of Zeta there, and you can see the bias to the south side of the convection still, but we're starting to see some more plumes on the northern end of things, and I think it's safe to say, and Kay, I think you could agree with me, that center of circulation is now definitely enveloped in a fair bit of convection at this point.
Yes, at this time the center has become fully covered by convection. There has been some attempts to rotate it up shear. There was a weak high pressure area that's developed over the Gulf of Mexico and imparted some northerly shear. But it appears that shear might have actually helped Zeta organize faster than we expected by pushing it further south.
Yeah, and I mean, structurally, with having most of the deep convection being well to the south and east of the center, although it's starting to wrap around more the actual center, having most of the northern semicircle bare, has been quite similar in structure to numerous other systems this year that have developed in somewhere in the Atlantic Basin. Good examples are Hannah, Sally, and Delta have had their convection rotate around and favored quick intensification phases, and that is, the general structure that we've seen perform well this year, and is generally an easy storm structure to get going once you get good rotation, which is why we're seeing the National Hurricane Center calling for more quick intensification. We're talking about a moderate tropical storm here at 50 miles an hour, but this has already gained 20 miles an hour, 15 knots, just in the past day. So it hasn't been, barely changing in strength or barely legging up in intensity by any means, even though it isn't really particularly strong yet.
Yes, we've noticed some quite significant pressure falls in the most recent Reconnaissance mission. It started off at around 1,003 millibars when the plane first arrived, and by the point it left a couple of hours later, it was down into the mid 990s rather. And that's indicative of an inner core forming within the storm, and once it gets that inner core, it would enable it to intensify much more easily.
I mean, we're going to be seeing this thing intensifying, I think, faster than any of us really expected at the beginning of the storm's life. Now that the storm centers are stacked, or at least about to be, I mean, the Yucatan, again, I know we mentioned it earlier this stream, I think they need to be looking out for a Category 2. I would be preparing as if a Category 2 is headed your way. And I believe our latest rating on the CDPS scale for this is a Stage 3 for the Yucatan Peninsula, according to Devin Williams, who is the creator of the scale. It's a Stage 3 on the CDPS right now, so that's still a significant storm that can cause substantiated damage. So I'd still be preparing for this. It's definitely something of concern, to say the least. Rainfall, strong winds, storm surge, all of that is definitely a possibility here.
Yeah, and just to go over a quick summary of the actual current active warnings for Zeta as well. We do have a hurricane warning in effect from Tulum to Rio Lagartos in Mexico, as well as Cozumel and a tropical storm warning in effect for Pinar del Rio in Cuba too. So even though it's a smaller system which is inhibiting its actual CDPS rating, there are numerous warnings in place already, not just in Mexico, but also in portions of western Cuba in case impacts deviate a little bit out to the east. Although it is possible if trends continue and you see a bit more of a westward nudge that you could see that potentially downgraded in Cuba, at least similar to what we saw happen with Delta.
Yeah, we'll see. There are a lot of comparisons to be made with Delta with this thing. It's a Western Caribbean storm that has a fair bit of time to intensify. It's probably going to head into the Yucatan as a stronger storm. It might hit the Yucatan at about the same intensity Delta did as a Category 2. We'll have to see. It's definitely, I think that the odds of it peaking around where Delta did are pretty low. Not impossible, but pretty low. I don't see this being a major, at least as of right now. It definitely could be, but as of now, I wouldn't be forecasting that.
And the reason for that is it just doesn't have enough time to get there.
No,
Only got to 30 hours maximum before land interaction would halt any intensification.
Yeah, despite its location being in the Western Caribbean in a landfall area right now, at least expected pretty similar to Delta, and also the size and original structure being similar, we do have those differences, as in this is much further to the south and west at this stage in its life than Delta was. Delta was moving pretty solidly to the west, if not west-northwest at closer to 15 miles an hour. This thing's basically stationary right now and is still going through early phases where it was relocating its center last night and this morning, and is now really trying to develop around that new center in a much more robust fashion.
And another important thing to note is that the origins of Delta and Zeta are quite different. They're formed from a tropical wave, whereas Zeta has developed from a trough. And the genesis of Zeta has been a much longer and more prolonged process than Delta, which has meant that it didn't have such a good structure from the word go, and it's had to work to get to a point where it's able to start strengthening, whereas Delta was immediately able to go off as soon as it became a tropical cyclone.
Yeah.
And I think, to carry on with that a little bit, the other main difference that we're going to see compared to Delta, and just for recency bias for people that are paying attention to Delta, is that it's quite unlikely that you'd see this get particularly strong in the Gulf of Mexico. It is definitely possible to see a hurricane there, but because of a mix of land interaction and then soon after that, the increase in shear that's going to happen as this trough picks it up and carries it very rapidly to the north and then north-northeast into the United States, it won't really have the same environmental conditions that Delta had to try to go at a much stronger secondary peak. It's more likely than not that any substantial initial peak will occur before landfall in the Yucatan Peninsula, with some more minor variance in the overall strength for the next several days as it goes into the Gulf of Mexico before it weakens on the final approach to the United States.
We can say that we can't rule out a major landfall in the Yucatan. I'm going to say right now, and some people may think this is bold, I am ruling out a major landfall in the United States. I don't see any way that this storm will be a major hurricane when it gets to the Gulf Coast.
Yeah, I think I have to agree with you on that one, because the Gulf just doesn't look like it's conductive for something, especially right before land. I don't think it's possible for it to make a major landfall.
Yeah, I'll put it like this. If people think the trough that picked up Delta and steered it into Louisiana and then picked it more up towards the central United States and towards the East Coast later on was strong, this one that's coming in is of a different category in terms of the shear it's going to be able to project over the system, especially because it's more in a developmental stage still. It's not going to be as robust as a structural system heading into the Gulf of Mexico. It'll be more prone to significant shear impacts, and that's why weakening below hurricane strength is anticipated by landfall. Although it is important to note people along the Gulf Coast from Louisiana to the western portions of the Florida Panhandle should still generally be preparing as if a hurricane were going to be coming on shore, just because of the off chance that that does end up occurring. It's better to be over-prepared in those scenarios than under-prepare.
Absolutely agree with that sentiment. I mean, if I'm in the Yucatan, I'd be preparing for a Category 2, even though a minimal Category 1's coming in, probably, according to the NHC. We think it'll be higher. But I'd be preparing for a Cat 2 right now. If I were in the United States, I'd be preparing for a Cat 1, high-end Cat 1, maybe even a Cat 2, just in case, you know. There is a possibility it doesn't, but I'd be beginning preparations if on the Gulf Coast, just in case, and I'd be trying to get those preparations completed if I were in the Yucatan by around this time tomorrow.
Which is not to say we expect a Category 2 to be approaching the United States, but if you prepare for a stronger storm than what you experience, you're likely to minimize the impacts it will have on you.
Yeah, you know, and it does also help protect in the off chances that such rare occurrences do occur. You know, back when Laura was entering the Gulf of Mexico and forecast to be a Category 2 at landfall, you know, all the officials, everyone was preaching to prepare as if this was going to be a Category 3 or 4 storm. And of course, that was the right move to take because those rare things can happen, although for this system, that isn't particularly likely by any manner, although it's still better to take those extra precautions regardless.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, when it comes to preparing for a storm like this, it's really important that, you know, first of all, you know what to prepare for. We actually on the Force 13 US Twitter just posted a nice few graphics that do tell you exactly what kind of hazards to expect. So you can go and check that out after the stream. But something else to consider is that you know, it's not just wind. I think that the biggest thing that I want to drive home at least is that storm surge, especially if Zeta does get larger in the Gulf, which it certainly could. I think that storm surge could be a more significant threat. I don't believe NHC has forecasts on storm surge right now, but I would anticipate that we'll start seeing more information on that within the next day or so.
Yeah, we'll probably start to see some preliminary ones come out tomorrow because the 3-day point right now is just over land. They'll start to potentially issue watches tomorrow afternoon, and that's when we'll start to get some of those more United States-centric graphics and more localized forecast data coming out from the National Hurricane Center and the Weather Prediction Center.
Sure. Something else that I did want to mention is that with these storms, we also do have Epsilon that's a thing, and that's making its transition right now into, well, a post-tropical cyclone. I think that Epsilon's time with us is probably coming to a close here in short order.
Thank God. Sorry.
Yeah, and I mean, it's at past 46 degrees north as a fully tropical cyclone still, although it is very close to not being tropical any longer. So that is a feat in itself. And we did mention at the top of the hour, but Iceland, portions of the United Kingdom and Ireland are going to have to pay attention to the system that Epsilon becomes when it merges with this other low, as it is expected to deepen quite significantly, although be well offshore when that happens, and then try to move towards those areas.
I mean, do we have an exact location on Epsilon at the minute?
A what? I'm sorry?
An exact location.
Yeah, 46.2 degrees north, 44.3 degrees west. So it is really far up there. If you want a reference for that, that is going to be the same latitude, I think, as northern Spain or Gascony in France. And it is also, if you're looking more westward, the same latitude as Newfoundland.
Strat, I just took
So
a
it's
center
really
for
far
a
up there.
storm. It's at 46. It's actually, I think, around 47 degrees north, 42 degrees west at this point, looking at the latest.
Yeah, I would have
satellite.
definitely moved more since then.
Yeah.
I think that makes it's the most northern storm in the Atlantic this season. Would I be wrong with that assumption?
At least to be fully tropical, yeah, because we did have Teddy, of course, come through
That's
Newfoundland
true, yeah.
and Nova Scotia, but it did turn post-tropical before that point. You know, Teddy was post-tropical before crossing 45 degrees north. So it could be the record breaker, at least for this year, although I don't think it is the record holder for all time. It is definitely something to note, though.
yeah, I think yeah, definitely not the most ever, but definitely pretty northern.
Yeah, it's a very northern storm at the minute. So again, Iceland, Great Britain, and the UK and Ireland. Yeah, we should all keep watch.
Just to give a reference though for how strong this system could get when it merges with this other low, which is really set to occur in about a day from now, models bring it down to about the 930s again in terms of millibars. So this is lower than epsilon ever was in its recorded life cycle. Once it merged with the system, it'll rapidly deepen substantially. And it is expected to be a hurricane force extratropical low out there in the northern Atlantic, so it could be wreaking havoc for shipping paths as it does so. Fortunately for land areas in Iceland and Greenland, this is going to be well offshore, and those winds are going to be to the south of the center, and they won't necessarily be impacting land. But you could see some tropical storm force winds as we head into the middle of next week, as the system will remain very large, although begin to weaken by Wednesday, start to creep onto Ireland, the United Kingdom, and Iceland.
Definitely a setup to acknowledge for sure. I mean, the GFS showing a system in the 930s here, down to 937 millibars at peak, with some runs getting it to sub 930. So the system's going to become quite powerful, and relatively widespread tropical storm force winds are shown on the GFS as well. So, I mean, it's definitely interesting. And we have a rather large swath of hurricane force winds as well on the GFS around 36 hours out, and that's completely out to sea. Those don't hit land, but still, that's definitely something to consider and look at.
I mean, just to give a perspective on the size, because I know it isn't on the screen right now, but these models are saying that you'll have tropical storm force winds on late Tuesday and early Wednesday, reaching from the coast of Greenland all the way to just offshore the western coast of Ireland. So this is going to be an absolutely massive storm in terms of size for the North Atlantic in the coming days. And fortunately, those core impacts won't be impacting people directly because they will be offshore. But like we did say earlier, they definitely will be wreaking some shipping havocs across the North Atlantic basin. I know we're covering both these systems and giving commentary extensively, but are you guys open up to take some questions from the chat as well?
Yeah,
Yeah, let's take some questions.
Fun.
Yeah, all right. Start your message with at Force13 or Force13 in text then. It lights up the message in a nice bright orange, lets us see it. If you have any questions about either of the Atlantic systems right now, happy to answer them. Feel free to send them in. And there's one right there. I don't know if anyone can answer this right off the bat. Does anyone have the temperature of the cloud tops on Zeta right now?
Get those real quick, and we can get a good estimate here in just a moment. But
those should be pushing minus 80s at this point, I think, based on the infrared imagery that's on the screen.
Yeah, for sure.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, it's definitely pushing out that much. I'm just going to check here and see what are our maximum cloud tops looking like. According to Real Earth, minus 91.
Wow.
Is the maximum cloud tops on Zeta right now. So those are some high cloud tops.
No kidding. That's definitely pretty interesting for the system.
Pretty intense, that's for sure. Definitely something that we do want to look at. We have a wall of questions that have come in here. Bear with us for a second. What does epsilon rank in how far north it is? Does anyone know?
Well, it's the top of this year. I'm not quite sure for all time, but it is notable in itself that it is still a tropical cyclone at its latitude. You do very seldom see this. I would presume just off a baseline on the rarity that it'd be in the top 25 because, this thing by 11 p.m. when it's designated post-tropical will probably be closer to 47.5 to 48 degrees north at that point. So it's going to be very far up there on the list.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's definitely quite an interesting area for it to be in, especially at this time of year.
All right, we have more questions here. When is the next advisory for Zeta? Half an hour, in fact, is the intermediate advisory, and then 3.5 hours from now we get our next full advisory with forecast data, and things like that. So we'll get a new intensity estimate in about half an hour, and we'll get a new full forecast intensity estimate, new all kinds of new stuff like tropical storm force wind probabilities and things like that. We'll get that in just about 3.5 hours. All right, next question. How much do you believe that Zeta will rapidly intensify, and if so, how severe could it be on a reasonable scale? So first of all, do we think that Zeta is going to intensify?
It definitely is a possibility. By how much it could, it's hard to say. It'll probably be minimal rapid intensification, which is a weird thing to say, minimal. But that's what I predict.
I do think something to note with Zeta in particular is that even though, you know, if it reaches rapid intensification, which is about 30 miles an hour, 25 knots within a 1 day period, it'll be a hurricane at that point. It's already been intensifying at a pretty quick pace. We are up 20 knots or 20 miles an hour about in the past day right now. So it could technically not rapidly intensify and just continue its current pace and still reach hurricane strength before landfall. So I know people focus a lot on rapid intensification, but even a scenario like this, we still have a likely hurricane if it doesn't match that pace.
I've just returned to the desk here after being away for a few minutes. My apologies to the team, but we do indeed have the intermediate advisory from the National Hurricane Center. They are staying with 50 miles per hour. However, the pressure is deepened slightly down to 997 millibars. There is no change to the watches and warnings at this time, so they do remain roughly the same. At 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, the center of Tropical Storm Zeta was located near latitude 18.0 degrees north, longitude 83.6 degrees west. Zeta has been meandering recently, but a northward motion is expected over the next couple of days, followed by a turn toward the north. On the forecast track, the center of Zeta will move near or over the northern Yucatan Peninsula or the Yucatan Channel late Monday, move over the southern Gulf of Mexico on Tuesday, and approach the southern Gulf Coast on Wednesday. Thomas, I believe that you are screen sharing something about Zeta here.
So I have Zeta imagery. I have the H-force rainfall ready to go, and I also have the cone. But something that I do want to mention right now, we did find while you were gone, minus 90s are right now blowing up in that southern side of convection, and Zeta does now have a full ring of convection around, or not a ring, but a full envelope of convection around its center, which is definitely not good news for those in the Yucatan. I did want to show the H-force rainfall forecast because I do think that this is important. At the Yucatan, we're going to see where the storm hits. We could see areas with up to 4 to 8 inches. And when the storm hits the United States, again, 4 to 8 inches with localized areas of 8 to maybe even 12 inches are definitely possible. And the H-force maximum rainfall point being up to 25 inches, so localized rainfall could be significantly higher than what's shown on a larger scale here. It's definitely something to note for sure. Something else that I did want to talk about as well is the GFS here, which really is going to give us a good idea of what Zeta's track is going to look like and what Epsilon's going to look like. We were talking about Epsilon a little bit earlier, so I do want to touch on it. Just with what the GFS is expecting for Iceland and the United Kingdom, which are both going to be in points of concern for this. We can see here Epsilon as it deepens rapidly, and you can see those hurricane force winds in the purples being quite widespread there. Luckily, though, this is expected to weaken back down by the time that it does impact Ireland with those tropical storm force winds along the coast, and it does impact Iceland with some less than normal conditions, to say the least. It looks like it will be weaker than some previous runs did show. All right. With that being said, yeah, that's all I got.
That is some pretty good information. Now, just looking on the satellite imagery right now for Zeta, I do notice that there is a rather large area of convection off to the east, currently impacting portions of Jamaica and eastern Cuba. Now, would that be in association with Zeta, or would that be something else?
Definitely say that it's associated with the same kind of energy as Zeta. This is actually, I believe, the bit of energy the GFS initially had developed here in the Caribbean before the southern bit developed into Zeta, and the GFS did in previous runs actually shoot this northward, which is where this is going to go. And I believe it did develop it near the Bahamas and further north at some points. Right now it's looking unlikely that this will manage to develop right now.
We just received a question here. When is the next Reconnaissance flight expected to take off, and do you think that an eyewall could very soon develop or is developing within Zeta?
I do not believe that an eyewall is developing at this time. It's certainly consolidating its inner structure and developing an inner core. How fast it's doing that, we will only know once the next recon gets in there, and that will be taking off in about 4 hours' time, getting into the storm 5 to 6 hours from now. So a little while yet till the next look at the storm structure. But once we have that, we'll be able to see how it's developing and have a much better estimate of how quickly it's developing.
That is a good information to take note. Now, I believe we did have upper level reconnaissance aircraft that took off quite recently, and what they do is they go around the storm and sample the environment around it and in front of it, and that allows us to have better forecasts. So regardless of what kind of reconnaissance plane we get, it is very valuable information, and that will be used in the National Hurricane Center's next forecast.
For sure. It looks like we do have some new ship's rapid intensification index probabilities for Zeta. And it looks like we have now a 43% chance of a 25 knot jump in 24 hours.
Now, I assume that the ship's model there is indicating that the storm does actually get its act together within the next few hours.
Yeah, I mean, it has been getting its act together as of recently. I mean, it's got convection around its center. I feel like structurally it's been improving significantly, and it is beginning to develop an inner core of sorts. So I think it is starting to get its act together, but we'll have to see.
So,
Yeah, and
Thomas, go ahead, Trap.
No, I was just going to say really quick, there's a question in the chat that we can answer, but that can wait after this statement.
Okay, now, Thomas, I know that you've been watching this, so I'll ask this question that just came through to us. When do you believe that the next Atlantic system will form, and when do you think it will form, and what entity?
Okay, so basically, are there any new developments that'll happen in the Atlantic, and what will they form from? Well, we have a few things, and I have the GFS pulled up right about here so we can get this. I think that vorticity is probably going to be the best thing to look at for this, so let's take a look at that. We can see, obviously, Epsilon and Zeta there, but there are a couple other things. First of all, we have that energy near Cuba, and you can see that pronounced a little bit in the wave kind of here, in a wave axis. And then we also have this wave in the MDR that could definitely develop as well. So something that's interesting is as we go out through time here, we can see this wave become much better pronounced here in a couple days' time as it does head in to the Caribbean. This does not develop on the GFS ultimately, I don't believe, but you can see a couple of closed isobars there. We have another wave of energy that comes in, another tropical wave, and you can see that there as well. We have a third one in the MDR. When we have numerous waves that do develop, the GFS, I think, does develop this one. Yes, it does. And that's an interesting bit of vorticity in the Gulf. But I think that what we're going to see, if I had to say anything, is we're probably going to see, I don't believe that the current wave of energy heading into the Caribbean is going to form. I don't believe that this other bit of energy that came off from Zeta is going to form either. What I do believe is that as we head into very late October, around Halloween time, all the way to around November 5th or 6th, I think in that general time frame, you're going to have a wave in the MDR that's going to head into the Caribbean, and I think it's going to develop somewhere in the Eastern Caribbean, and it's going to be a Western Caribbean storm. So that's my general prediction for when the next formation is going to be and where it would be.
Now,
Another question in the chat as well. This is what I wanted to bring up earlier. I'm sorry about that.
Go ahead.
They're asking, is Zeta going to act with this, low near Colorado and potential impacts further up the East Coast as we get towards days 4 and 5? And the simplest answer really is that area that's bringing snowfall over large portions of Colorado and will even bring snow to Texas in the next day or so is what's going to be picking this system up into the United States very quickly and will absorb Zeta around day 4 and dissipate it as it merges. And that itself could bring some more significant rainfall totals to broader regions along the eastern seaboard of the United States and potentially some snowfall to New England later this week, although it is a very complex system and certainties on that aren't quite high yet, rather than knowing its presence.
That is a good observation. Now, I'm not sure if he's still here, but I'm sure that Kay would like to answer this question. Do we think that Zeta will become a hurricane within the next 24 hours?
That's the current National Hurricane Center forecast, is for a hurricane at 24 hours, if I'm correct. But yeah, it's quite likely, and it could do so in 18 hours or maybe even 12 hours from now if it develops that core quickly and begins rapid intensification. And that's, of course, the big if of this situation, because the sooner it begins rapid intensification, the more time it will spend strengthening at that fast rate, and the stronger its landfall will be. If it has already begun rapid intensification, then we could see a landfall approaching major hurricane status, which would be very worrisome for the Yucatan. But on the other end of the scale, if the storm becomes more disorganized again and we lose ground with the storm strengthening, the ground that we've seen with the most recent mission, then it may not even be a hurricane as it leaves the Yucatan rather, which would give it no chance of being a hurricane for the Gulf Coast. So it's important to not just focus on the impacts in the Yucatan, because how strong it gets in the Caribbean will limit how strong it can be in the Gulf, and that will then affect how strong it is when it gets to the United States coast in 3 days' time.
And I think just a note on that as well. Right now, the consensus forecast is for a hurricane at the Yucatan at landfall and just shy of hurricane strength when making landfall in the U.S. The 5-mile-an-hour difference between those two landfalls in the National Hurricane Center different forecast, even though it's a barrier between categories, the overall impacts you'd see, at least from wind speed, isn't really that different, even though the potential structure of the system by the time it reaches the Gulf Coast could be marginally different than it is right now. So that really goes to emphasize that people, both in the Yucatan and the Gulf Coast, shouldn't be preparing in a drastically different manner just because the forecast intensity from the National Hurricane Center at landfall for each of those spots is different by 5 miles an hour.
Now, I've been observing this with everyone else in my team here, and this viewer asked a question here. Why is all of these storms' convection mainly placed to the south currently? Now,
well, there's been a bit of northerly shear on this today, and I feel that would explain why convection in Zeta is to the south. But as for the season as a whole, there's no sort of environmental condition that would cause storms to be displaced to the south. It's just a coincidence at best.
An explanation for it, other than minor shear loss that can be a bit more pushy when storms are in their formative stages and cause those center relocations, are that because it's younger in its life cycle and has had those center relocations, it didn't really form its new and more dominant current center in the center of its deep convection. It formed it more along the northern periphery of it. So it's taking time now to actually wrap its main thunderstorm activity around to the northern half, which, despite the circulation being quite robust, the actual thunderstorm activity on that half of the system still hasn't developed quite yet to match what we're seeing on the southern half of the storm.
that is a good observation. I'd just like to go over the current key messages from the National Hurricane Center right now. They do note hurricane conditions and storm surge are expected in portions of the northern Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico Monday night and early Tuesday. Tropical storm conditions could occur over extreme western Cuba on Monday. Through Wednesday, heavy rainfall is expected from Zeta over portions of central and western Cuba, the Cayman Islands, Jamaica, the northeast Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, southern Florida, and the Florida Keys. This rainfall may lead to flash flooding in urban areas. Zeta is forecast to be at or just below hurricane strength when it approaches the northern Gulf Coast on Wednesday, and there is an increasing risk of storm surge, rainfall, and wind impacts from Louisiana to the Florida Panhandle. Residents in these areas should monitor the progress of Zeta and updates to the current forecast. Now looking at the Weather Prediction Center's current rainfall, they have a day 1, which is today, excessive rainfall outlook of a slight risk category for southern Florida. This means that there is a 10% chance of flash flooding within a 50-mile point anywhere in this yellow shaded area, which is the slight risk. Surrounding that towards the north is a marginal risk, which is a less percent chance, 5%, of flash flooding within 50 miles of a point. Getting into some more comments and questions that have been coming in, do keep them coming in. Could a trout pick up Zeta, hit Florida Panhandle, and go out to sea? What are our team's thoughts on that?
I think I put it in the chat as well, but unless this trough comes in way sooner and dips further to the south and then moves east at a quicker pace, it'd be quite unlikely to see this come across, anywhere further east than the far eastern portion of the Florida Panhandle, or far western portion, I'm sorry. And then even after that point, it's really going to mostly ride up the eastern seaboard or Appalachia as it gets absorbed by this trough. So you won't really have a distinct system at all by the time the trough really decides to kick off the eastern coast as we head into, very early Friday. Could you have an area of low pressure that is the trough developing into a system after it absorbs Zeta off the east coast later this week into the weekend? Yes, but it won't really be Zeta at all.
Yeah, I feel like for the Florida Panhandle, the most that it currently looks like it's going to get is very minimal effects, maybe some little bit of rain, but that's just if you're in Florida, it doesn't look like you need to worry too much.
We'll say, at least for now, portions of the far western Florida Panhandle could still see an excess of 2 inches of rain if the current forecast is right. So people in the very western tip of Florida and then into Alabama, Mississippi, and now a more likely landfall location, Louisiana, do need to be paying particular caution to this.
Now, Strat, I know when we've been referring to Zeta's intensification phase, we know that it's likely to become a hurricane. We know that it's probably going to peak as a Category 1. Is there the off chance that this could get to Category 2, maybe even pushing Category 3 if the storm gets lucky?
If it were to do it, it would have to do it before it makes landfall in the Yucatan Peninsula. It might have a very brief period after emerging into the Gulf of Mexico to organize briefly before shear picks up significantly as this trough yanks it north at a rapid pace. But it's not going to have the same environment as Delta, where it had about a day and a half before conditions became more hostile. I think it's hard to see this getting past 90 miles an hour just for the fact that it really only has 30 hours and it's still in a more formative stage. And the actual core is larger than, say, Delta, for example. But you could see something like Hannah, which went from a minimal tropical storm to that high-end Category 1 strength at 90 miles an hour within 36 hours of landfall, starting off with a pretty similar structure, wrapping around and improving in symmetry, and then becoming a high-end Category 1 storm before coming on shore land. That, definitely isn't something to be ruled out. And regardless, it still is going to be intensifying relatively quickly unless it completely botches its core. If we're talking about a 75 to 80 mile an hour landfall from the National Hurricane Center, that would still be indicative of 25 to 30 miles an hour of intensification in about the next 24 to 36 hours. So even if it doesn't get up to those higher tiers, it's still forecast to strengthen quite quickly.
That is a good observation, I would say. Now, I'm sure that, Strat, you could discuss this with me. We just have a question that's come in here. Could we be seeing potential subtropical formation in the South Atlantic? So, on my screen here, I've currently got the GFS run, which has really been hinting at an interesting scenario in the South Atlantic recently. So you can see here we have this interesting system right here that the Brazil Meteorological Department has been noting has the potential to develop into a subtropical cyclone. And Force 13 is currently giving us a 50% chance at becoming a subtropical cyclone. And as you can see, that system does put off towards the southeast and eventually dies off. But you can see this interesting feature right here. That's further towards the south and west. That could also be another subtropical cyclone that does form later on down the line. Now, Strat, do you think that these two subtropical cyclones could form, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, pretty similar to last night as well. There's been some general model support that at least one of these will develop, particularly the northern one. Models have backed off a bit on the intensity, but they are still in pretty good agreement that we could see some subtropical development from this more northerly feature within the next 24 hours, and then have it unwind by the time we get to hour 48 or hour 60. After that, still, as we get to days 2 and 3, we have this other system that could potentially try to spin up quickly, as you noted in the models. And there's also global model agreement that such a thing could occur as well. Although by the time we get to day 4, that should also be ricocheting out to the south and east and be absorbed into a larger system or dissipate as well. So both of these have models indicating that they can develop or will. For example, the European robustly develops both of them into subtropical cyclones, but their overall lifespans, if they come to fruition, will still be quite short.
I can absolutely see that happening. Going back over to Zeta, which is our main focus this hour, it's quite an interesting situation which we've got going on with Zeta. Some models do take it off towards Texas, I believe, that the Euro was hinting, if I recall. And some models, a majority of them, do indeed take it towards Louisiana. Strat, what do you think is the most likely outcome track-wise when it comes to Zeta?
I mean, we're really at about 3 days out till U.S. landfall, and of course there is that deviation where it could yank westward towards the European, although it would actually have to go outside the cone of uncertainty. So it would have to go more than a standard deviation to the left for that to happen. And that would be, around less than 20%, closer to 15% odds of something like that happening in the first place, if we're just using numbers, not actually looking at the guidance. If we take a look at the guidance, the European, at least the 12Z, which you got to keep in mind, was made around 8 a.m. today, Eastern time, does have it much further west than the current consensus. And I'm assuming based on the updated track being slightly further west than last night, now much more indicative of a Louisiana potential landfall, but not pulling that far. The National Hurricane Center is taking those into consideration, but sticking with the global guidance on top of that outlier.
Now, on my screen here, I do have the model runs pulled up. I do notice track-wise, all but the CTCI is calling for a landfall on the Yucatan Peninsula. Now, of course, the CTCI is an interpolated model, so we shouldn't be using that. But it seems that the general agreement is a landfall on the Yucatan Peninsula in around 30 to 36 hours from now. And then the spread does increase when it goes up towards the U.S. Gulf Coast. This could make landfall anywhere from southwest of New Orleans all the way over to Mobile, Alabama. So there is quite a large spread when it comes to this system's track. And users aren't reminded to pay attention to the exact point on the cone because impacts do, of course, extend outside of that cone. We're going to take a short break here in a few minutes, but getting into some more comments or questions that have came in. How many storms do we believe will form in 2020 so far, going into November?
We really can't say for sure, can we? Again, I'm not sure off the top of my head. Anyone else?
We're at 27 right now, right, with Zeta? At least
I
named
believe so.
storms.
Names 27 named, yes.
The record for total storm formation, if I'm not mistaken, in early November, although it still is too early to really put a hammer in that one and say this is a real opportunity. Other than that, it is looking with the MJO and other atmospheric conditions, such as the gyro that could develop, that we could see a couple Caribbean storms come up, and that doesn't really include the subtropics. So we really could push that 30 number.
That is something that we should indeed monitor closely. as we do end up going into November. Do we think that we'll have a major hurricane in November, like maybe perhaps a Paloma 2008-like track?
It'd probably have to be in the Caribbean if we were going to see one. Epsilon was on the absolute cusp of barely being able to do it with the conditions granted to it. As we move into November, sea surface temperatures will continue to retreat. If we were to get a particularly strong storm, it most likely have to be in the Caribbean, which isn't impossible by any means. But fortunately, we're starting to see the odds for stronger systems at peak begin to drop off.
Yeah, like systems like Epsilon, I don't think will basically have a chance to happen again for the rest of the season anywhere except for the Caribbean. And that's, again, the more we go through this, the more it looks like there'll be weaker systems. Maybe like Category 1 and 2 hurricanes in the Caribbean is probably the max I think we could get for the rest of the season.
We're going to take a short break here. We'll be back in a few minutes to turn over now to the Western Pacific for the scene over there. Stay tuned. You're watching the second hour of our live coverage here on Force 13, and we are now covering Typhoon Molave, which is currently moving over the Philippines with estimated winds of 85 miles per hour. Let's bring up my team with the latest on Molave. Thomas, what are you seeing on Molave right now as you have some satellite imagery showing on your screen?
Well, with Molave, something to note is that convection has waned significantly with Molave in these latest frames. I know we have some visible imagery going right now, but if you take a look at this satellite imagery, there are two things to note. First of all, convection overall is waning, which looks like good news. The bad news appears to be that we are seeing a very clear center point of even lower cloud temperatures, which makes me think that there is a fair possibility of this becoming the beginnings of an eye popping out or some sort of eye wall. And I am worried about this rapidly intensifying as it does move into the South China Sea.
Now, I do notice on the satellite imagery, just after the center reemerged over some land, there was a massive convective blowup in one of the outer bands on the western side. That may lead to some additional intensification down the road, and we could be seeing perhaps some rapidly intensifying scenarios as the storm pushes towards Vietnam. However, conditions do get worse for the storm a little bit as it approaches land. So we will likely see some weakening as the storm approaches land. How much weakening, that is yet to be seen. We are now joined by the one and only Nathan Foy. How are you doing, Nathan?
One and only, apparently. Malave has traversed through the Philippines rather quickly, hasn't it?
Absolutely. I know that you were live earlier today. What were your thoughts on its intensity as it passed through the Philippines?
Well, the eye was starting to pop out when it was first making landfall, which was at about 4 p.m. I think it was 4 or 5 p.m. local time yesterday. It looked very impressive not so long ago when it was first moving over Mindoro. It's now just emerged off the western coast. Somewhat of an eye there. It's hard to tell, but I've got a feeling here that this is paving the way for some significant intensification in the South China Sea, and that is what some of the models are now picking up on. We could see this get up to Category 3 on its way to Vietnam. That's the last thing we need over there with serious flooding problems in Vietnam.
Now, Thomas, I know that you're showing some satellite imagery here. What are you forecasting this storm to get up to now that it perhaps may be going into a phase of rapid intensification?
Well, earlier today, I know we issued a cone with a peak of 105 miles per hour. Assuming rapid intensification does occur, because we do have to assume that it would probably occur within this general area. Sea surface temperatures begin to drop off as we do get closer to Vietnam. Realistically, when it comes to rapid intensification, I would probably forecast 110 miles per hour right now. But I mean, it's hard to say. I think the ceiling is a 120 mile per hour Category 3 for it, though, and we'll just have to see.
Could I bring in some news here, Ethan?
Sure.
The Pigasa have just put out their 8 a.m. Advisory or warning information. Signal 3 remains in effect for Batangas and for most of Mindoro, except the southern tip, really. Signal 2 for the Calamian group of islands, for the northern part of Romblon, for Marinduque, and also for significant parts of Luzon, including Metro Manila, Signal 2.
I'm just pulling that up now on my screen here. Hopefully I'll get that up here in a few moments. But yes, those warnings have just been updated. Now, have they issued any Signal 4 warnings? I'm not sure what their criteria is over there for warnings, so...
No, it's got to be much stronger to get a Signal 4. I think we're talking basically the threshold for Category 3 status would mean that.
And this storm is, of course, nowhere near Category 3 intensity. So if you do have any comments or questions or even reports or observations as Malave, Philippine Name Quinta, pushes through the area, please do send them in the comment section, and we will relay those to our team, and we'll have our thoughts on that. Looking forward towards the forecast for the storm, the TTWC, I recall, are going for a peak of 110 miles per hour. What are conditions looking like for this storm right now, wind shear wise and sea surface temperatures wise?
Those are going to be very conducive for about the next 2 days right now. Mostly 36 hours within that time frame. They're going to start to get less favorable by the time we get to 48 hours from now. And of course, going towards landfall, they're going to become increasingly hostile. it's not really the sea surface temperatures that'd be too much of a concern for the system. Its path from where it is right now all the way towards a likely landfall area in the Philippines are more than conducive enough above 27 and 28 degrees Celsius to support a significant hurricane strength system. Its issue is going to be as it continues to move through the South China Sea, that wind shear is going to pick up in a very large manner, similar to how it happened with Saudel, and cause substantial weakening before it finally comes on shore in Vietnam. Regardless of that, though, it is still going to be a very large rainfall threat for Vietnam, as it has been for portions of the Philippines during its passage.
And now, looking forward over here at Saudel, as I bring the satellite imagery over to Saudel at the moment, what are we seeing observation-wise for Saudel? Has it made landfall? Has it not made landfall? I know that the latest GTWC forecast had it offshore. I'm not sure if it's made landfall yet, so what's the latest on Saudel, Strat, if you have that information?
I mean, their latest saying it's just offshore. At this point, it really should be moving inland pretty imminently within the next couple hours at most. Regardless of that, because so much of its convection has been sheared away to the south and west of the center, the core impacts have already been on land for some time and will continue to be mostly of substantial rainfall risk, as it's already down to tropical depression strength and winds. Nowhere near its 100-mile-an-hour peak, I think, that we had about 2 days ago. Regardless of that, its lack of any substantial movement in the past day has meant that even though it's being sheared quite heavily, rainfall has had the potential to be concentrated over pretty similar areas, which of course is a risk for places that are still under watches right now.
Absolutely. I've just got imagery now pulled up of Solave, and, well, it looks terrible. Now, I recall that wind shear was beginning to get to the storm due to outflow from Malave. I'm not sure if that's affected Solave a little bit, but it's now inland, and Solave's story is coming to a close. And then now Vietnam has
Saudel, Ethan.
my apologies. I always get these pronunciations of the West Pacific storms wrong.
Yeah. Well, they can get tricky sometimes, definitely.
And it is hard to note in that particular infrared shot there, but it is still a depression with a circulation, although it's becoming increasingly elongated and weak as cloud tops are basically non-existent with the storm at this point. Regardless of a lack of high cloud tops, though, it is still dumping some rainfall over Vietnam, and its sheared remnants are going to be somewhat of a rainfall threat further inland, as they have been for some time.
So we have some few questions that have came in here. Let me see if I can try to find some. I know that this system will probably get up to Category 2 intensity. We could be looking at a Category 3 peak. At this moment, I personally probably would not sit my money on it. I'd probably go with a 110 mile per hour peak. What do we think about... that's an idiot question here. Anyway, what rainfall totals are we forecasting for Vietnam? Anyone have that information?
From the combined systems, or
just from
Malave?
Just from Malave.
Let's see. Pulling up the GFS's forecast really quick, just to get one scenario out. And I know people at the HWRF solutions as well, but you are looking at a broad area that could be getting well over 300 to 400 millimeters plus of rainfall in central Vietnam. This is going to be further south than the core impacts from Saudel, although not by very much of a substantial margin, and there is going to be some overlap. But heading into Vietnam, there is going to be numerous areas that are going to be getting over 400 millimeters of rainfall, and even inland into Cambodia and Thailand, and even Laos, you're going to be seeing some areas getting at least 100 millimeters of rainfall in association with Molave as it moves inland.
Indeed. Looking off into a little bit of the future here, I'll pull up the GFS run here for the Western Pacific. We have Invest 99W, which could develop into a tropical cyclone in the Western Pacific. I know that some models were hinting at that. Nathan, aren't you giving that currently a 60% chance of development, I believe?
Which one's that?
Invest 99W, located near
Yes.
the Mariana Islands.
That one's gaining some steam just a little bit right now. Models suggesting that it won't be particularly strong to begin with. Looks like another landfall in the central Philippines. And even the weaker storms, we know they can dump tons of rain and cause loads of problems. But shortly I'll have imagery of a different kind for you, and we can have a little discussion about that as well in a moment.
Okay.
And just a note as well, on top of 99W, and I know, if we're going longer range, there's potential areas of interest in the Western Pacific that could also go to the Philippines again as we head into next week. Longer range, and this isn't any certainty, there is some model support for potentially seeing Hone finally come to life in the Central Pacific for everyone that's been waiting for it all year. Well away from land north and west of Hawaii, but potentially next week, that is something to watch as well for a basin that's been completely quiet.
Don't give me hope.
I remember, I was gonna do this thing. If Hone didn't form, I'm just gonna compile every time you would name it.
I won't give you too much hope, but there is some indication that we could see it happen next week, although that is long range and subject to significant variance at this point in time.
I guess we'll see then.
That does indeed bear watching, as Hone could potentially come to life in the Central Pacific according to Strat. Looking at the GFS model here currently on my screen, you can see right there is Molave dying over Vietnam. And here is Invest 99W, probably becoming a tropical cyclone just offshore of the Philippines. Now, this is just one model run, and this is a scenario that could happen. But most of its intensification looks to be, once again, in the South China Sea, as has been a common occurrence. Now, I do notice that there is also another tropical cyclone that develops behind 99W, near the Southern Mariana Islands, and that one looks like that it could be a potential strong system headed towards the Philippines again. That is very long range, and that probably will change given that it's on the GFS. But regarding 99W, at this point, given that Malave is headed into the South China Sea, I'd probably bet that 99W would really struggle, given that sea surface temperatures will probably be upwelling due to Malave, and we probably won't be seeing that strong of a system in the South China Sea if 99W ends up forming. Thomas, I see that your screen sharing some. Go ahead, Strat.
I was just going to say, for anything really in the South China Sea, I wouldn't completely rule out potential strengths yet, just because the area that these systems are moving into have seldom seen any activity this entire year. So even if Molave tries to stir up some water, there's still going to be a good amount left over in a couple days that hasn't been too disrupted for potential strengthening or maintaining of intensity for future systems.
That is a good indication that we need to watch closely. Now, Thomas, I see that you have the HWRF model pulled up, I see.
Dude, this is a really interesting plot courtesy of RAM. It shows you the maximum winds and mean sea level pressure here. What I like so much about this compared to something on Tidbits, you get the close-up and the far-away shot. But something that I found from the H-Wharf, and this was just something, this was new to me. I hadn't known that it was going this strong at this point. The H-Wharf jumps this storm from 57 to 92 knots. I just want to note that in the span of 6 hours, which is about right now.
My bet probably on that would, when it reads out that 57 knot rating, which is a high-end tropical storm, it's probably just indicating the winds over water, and it's not indicating the winds that are actually occurring over land. I'm not sure if that's how the HWF works, but that is certainly something that may be indicated.
But the interesting thing I wanted to note really was that the H-Wharf does show some rapid intensification in the South China Sea, all the way up to 100 knots, which does constitute a major Category 3 typhoon. The biggest reason I say this is because we were talking about the ceiling of this storm earlier. I do think that the realistic ceiling of this storm in the South China Sea is about 120 to 125 miles per hour. But then again, we are expecting some weakening into Vietnam, but a Category 2 typhoon landfall into Vietnam can't be ruled out either.
We just have a contributor behind the scenes here that has just pointed out something very interesting here to me. So far, this system, Molave Quinta, has made 5 landfalls in the Philippines. These are all in local times. At 6:10 p.m., it made landfall in San Miguel Island, Tabaco City, on the 25th of October. It did made another landfall 40 minutes later in Malino, Albay, once again in the Philippines, of course. It then made another landfall at 10:30 in San Andreas, and another landfall at 1:20 a.m. this morning in Torrijos, and then another one quite recently on Mindoro. If you have any comments or questions, please do send them into the chat, and we will ask them in due course as the system does continue to exit the Philippines and now push towards Vietnam. So what are we thinking wise currently for rainfall when it comes to Malave, Thomas?
Well, I know we mentioned this a little bit earlier, but I do have the HWRF solution up here. We can see there still as it heads off the coast of the Philippines, still that pink dot, that over 32 inches possible, where that rain max you can see down here of around 48 inches comes from. Then we have the storm moving through the South China Sea, and as it impacts land, first of all, Hainan could get 4 to 8 inches still. Yet another big dumping of rain after Sawdell. Then we're going to have this storm hit land, and you'll see there relatively widespread 8 to 16 inch areas there, with some localized 16 to 24 and even 24 to 32 contours. So I'd say if you're in Vietnam, Vietnam's been hit by storm after storm after storm this year. Weaker storms, but they've been dumping a lot of rain. This is definitely going to pose a flood threat, which is definitely unfortunate considering that the storm is heading into an area that's been prone to flooding now throughout the entirety of the year. So Vietnam definitely doesn't need more rain right now, and it looks like that's exactly what they're going to get.
Now, we do have a contributor here in the call. Christian, what are your thoughts about the storm right now?
About
Malave.
I forget the name. Malave. Thank you for that. Honestly, I've got nothing to add on to what people are saying at this time. Yeah, that's just me. I've got nothing. I do apologize.
Now, we do have some questions that have come in. Could Malave reform in the North Indian Ocean?
Is there any model support for that?
I really don't think there is any. This thing will very almost certainly, not almost certainly, it just will get completely chewed up by the mountainous terrain as it crosses Vietnam and enters the rest of Southeast Asia here. There isn't any prospects for it to redevelop in the Indian Ocean. And even so, if a model was trying to say that would almost certainly be past 10 days to the point where you couldn't really use it with any reliable sense.
Could we see rapid intensification for Malave? Absolutely. We absolutely could. Some models do indicate that this system could get up to Category 3 intensity, with the JTWC even forecasting just below that threshold. Now, in the last hour, we did cover it a little bit. There is some potential subtropical cyclone genocides, I should say, in the South Atlantic. Nathan, do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Oh dear, well, it's on. You can see it here on my screen, this disturbance now moving off the coast of Brazil, not far from Rio de Janeiro, as it happens, to the east. And this system right now expected to gather momentum in the next 24 hours, up to 48 hours, and then its chances will be extinguished. But right now, we are looking really at a coin toss on whether this becomes a subtropical nameable cyclone or not. It's going to be fascinating to see. And there's also another area to the southwest that's got a low chance that you never know. It's in a year like this, then maybe both of them might form. Who knows?
Would this southwest system be the southernmost system, if it did form, southernmost system to form in the South Atlantic?
I don't think so. It might be close, but my instinct says no. But I just wanted to bring that to your attention. You're already starting to see just the tiny rumblings of rotation there. Nothing clear-cut just yet, but the system is actually a thing now. It's not model hyperbole. It's actually something that does exist.
Yeah. And just to really clear up Nathan as well, if it were to develop, it'd really have to be within the next 24 to 48 hours too, right? We're looking at something past that time where it just wouldn't be able to do much.
48 hours is your absolute maximum.
That is a good estimate regarding that South Atlantic storm.
And
we do have...
Also,
go ahead, Strap.
Yeah, I was just going to say sorry to butt in, Nathan, as well, but do you have anything about the one further to the south of that as well, which models have also been trying to develop a little bit in about 3 days or so?
Well, I don't have it on the imagery, but from what I can see at the moment on one of my other screens, there's a lot of convection blowing up over Argentina right now. That could be it. The energy coming off that once it moves over the South Atlantic. But you're looking at very low chances. But if it did happen, and I say 10% chance probably at most, you're looking at Santa Catarina area getting that system.
Something to look out for by the looks of it. What is the area of interest behind Malave? Will it have a chance to develop over the next few days? It does, absolutely. If you do have any comments or questions, please do send them in, and we will get to them in due course. So, Thomas, what are you thinking about Invest 99W? As that question just came in. What are your thoughts about that?
On the GFS, and you can see there that closed isobar, which basically indicates that we do have an area of low pressure in the Western Pacific. I think that most of us here can agree that it's fairly likely that it'll develop. I believe Nathan has given it a 60% chance of development at this point, which I find to be pretty reasonable at this point. You can see there the GFS nearly developing it. There was a point in time when this was expected to be significantly stronger, and if I just go back a few runs, where you can look at it from about 2 days ago, we were seeing a 944 millibar system out of this being possible, and now we're all the way down to a minimal TDTS. So, the models can change, but as of now, I'd still say it's more likely than not that it will develop generally. We had it at 70% at one point of development on our tropical weather outlooks, but I think that the 60% right now is fair, and I think there is now a fair chance that this doesn't develop. Regardless of that, though, there is some long-range consistency with the system behind it potentially becoming significant, and that's definitely something that we're going to want to watch as well. But yeah, 99W overall looks like it may hold off on development until after the Philippines, but it looks like still GFS pretty consistent with the South China Sea system forming out of this.
So I just want to ask a question here to our team here. With this most recent development in the in the South China Sea, how we've just been having a train of storms, so to speak, when will it end? If at all.
No.
December, probably.
I really hope so. Really hope it ends.
They always come to an end. At the very latest, you'll be looking at the turn of the year.
Is there any
It's
chance of
looking like
something? You can go.
Looks like it's going to be late November into early December.
I mean, if we're looking at just the current, longer range forecasts, of course, past 5 days and especially 7, you have to take them with much more of a grain of salt. They don't directly develop anything in this current cycle of systems forming east or near the Philippines, crossing into the South China Sea or near it. After the investor potential area of interest behind 99W, which could potentially be a stronger system as we head into early November, although that's really still yet to be seen. But we were saying for quite some time this year that because the Western Pacific was generally less favorable for significant activity, that we could see some late season storms at these lower latitudes. And that is really what we're seeing right now, this train of systems coming through east of the Philippines, past them and into the South China Sea.
That is a good comment there, Strat. Could we see 2 or 3 rapidly intensifying systems around the globe within the next 2 to 3 weeks?
Yes. Quite simply, yes. I mean, 2 to 3 rapidly intensifying systems within the next 2 to 3 weeks. Okay, well, let's talk about storms that probably will. Okay, we'll start with our good friend in the Western Pacific, Malave or
Malave.
Malave. After that, we have Zeta. Those two could definitely rapidly intensify. We're going to have the system in the Caribbean that'll probably develop within the next week or two. We're going to have another system behind Molave that'll probably do something that could rapidly intensify. I think that there's a fair possibility. I'd give it a 60% chance that we'll see 3 or more rapidly intensifying tropical cyclones globally within the next few weeks.
We just had an interesting question come through. Will Invest 99W be like Typhoon Kroza back in 2013? Now, Typhoon Kroza was a storm that formed in between Luzon and the Mariana Islands, became as a Cat 2 typhoon as it bypassed Luzon just barely to the north, and then slowed down quite significantly, intensified to a Category 3 in the South China Sea, and died off before hitting Vietnam. What are our team's thoughts on that?
I can see where this is going. Because Croso was at this time of year, and what was the next storm?
Oh.
And people suggesting that maybe we'll have a pattern like that. Doubtful, very doubtful. I would say that Luzon has a much higher chance of getting the strongest typhoon landfall of the year. But as for this one, no, basically. Moving through the Philippines, quite weak. Could be moderate, tropical storm, but it's going to pan towards the south.
I'm curious as to what models are indicating its intensity.
It's more likely right now, at least, that it's going to be in its developmental stages as it's crossing the Philippines. If you use the GFS, for example, it's a weak tropical storm crossing the Philippines, and then once it emerges into the South China Sea, it becomes a typhoon. That's pretty well in line with some of the other computer models, which are developing it as it takes that west-southwest dive and crosses the Philippines. Of course, because it isn't actually having a closed center yet, those are to be taken with more of a grain of salt, but we can use them to have some understanding that we wouldn't necessarily be looking at an extremely powerful typhoon at this point in time coming through the Philippines in about 5 days, but we could see a storm that could bring significant rainfall totals to similar areas that just saw a lot of rain and are still seeing rain from this current system.
We just had a question come here before I go to Thomas here. Will Invest 99W become a tropical cyclone? Probably at some point. Thomas, what are you showing?
I'm showing the GEFS ensembles. Now, there are a lot of runs of this that you could go to, and this isn't the latest run. This is actually as of 0Z on the 24th, so about 2 days ago. The reason that I'm showing this is because this is what I call the big guns. This goes all the way up to 840 hours. So what this can do is this can give us a general idea of what to expect in the Western Pacific over the next month or so. So I thought it would be really interesting for all of us to look through this together, since I know we've had questions about the long range, and we can talk about what exactly the long range solutions could be. So generally, here we are with Molave, which is heading into the South China Sea. We can see our Invest 99W developing out there in the Western Pacific. And then we can see that Invest behind it as well. These are 3 different things, and as the orange comes in, that basically represents the amount of uncertainty when it comes to the pressure. You can see there where there are individual splotches of orange. Those are individual tropical cyclones. But what we'll notice is this big blob of more intense tropical cyclones. That's 904 millibars, 926, 971. I mean, there are some pretty intense tropical cyclones that develop out of this next wave, but basically it looks like the general trend, the general pattern is going to be, as we head well into November, into December, is that we're going to have basically a train of Westpac systems develop, and we're going to see a split, and I think we have a split in guidance depending on where these storms form. They're all going to form, looks like out in this general part of the Western Pacific Ocean. The question is, if they form further north, looks like they'll recur. If they don't, it looks like a Philippine hit is possible. So it looks like the big determiner of where these storms are going to go is going to be just where exactly they form. But regardless, we can see there are some pretty intense solutions given by the models. And even as we head into late November, there are numerous solutions showing a tropical cyclone out in the western Pacific.
Something to watch very closely. There's quite a lot to watch over the next few days closely when it comes to the tropics. Several people are asking, how is Epsilon still tropical at 48 degrees north, and for how long will it remain tropical? Now, I know that we covered Epsilon briefly last hour, so does anyone want to go over Epsilon once more?
Well, based on its current structure, if it isn't declared post-tropical at the 11 p.m. Eastern advisory, and they're actually using GMT time for it now, so it'd be 3 a.m. GMT time, it would be declared post-tropical by morning time, 9 a.m. GMT. That'd be the 5 a.m. Eastern advisory time point. I don't know if you have satellite imagery for it on stream right now, but it is really completing that transition. It did a really good job at holding its core together as a warm core system, despite having peripheral features for a very large portion of its lifetime. But baroclinic forcing, its actual latitude, and sea surface temperatures are really going to kill off any remaining tropical features with it in the very near future.
We have some damage photos from Malave as it pushed through the Philippines that Thomas are screen sharing.
Yeah, we can see those accordingly. This first one, we have significant, it looks like roof damage to a house in the back here. It looks like we have even more significant damage to this house. It looks like a tree that might be downed on it. We have a power line that's down. That's obviously extremely dangerous, but significant damage for sure from Malave. You can see here more damage photos. Trees just in a line, uprooted. Definitely a sign of a powerful tropical cyclone. And at least on the Saffir-Simpson scale, that indicates at least a strong Category 1. So that's definitely something to consider as well. Another perspective on that downed power line, again, something very dangerous. And you can see here some of those wires sticking out. That's extremely dangerous. So if you're in the Philippines and you have something like a downed power line like this, you want to avoid it. You don't want to touch it. Definitely do not touch it. These wires could be live, they could be exposed, and that could cause some extremely severe impacts if you happen to touch it. So don't touch those, as that could be life-threatening. And finally, we have more damage photos of trees that have fallen over, of damage to these homes. It really is a sad sight to see. And, the thing is, this could have been worse. And hopefully everyone is okay.
That is a troubling part of a tropical cyclone is the aftermath, and it's very important that you know how to deal with that and ensure your survival. Even after the system's long gone, several really dangerous effects could still linger, despite the storm being days, perhaps weeks, long gone. If you have any comments or questions or even observations from Malave in the Philippines, please do send them into the chat and we will relay those to our team members and get their thoughts in the future. Looking forward in the forecast for Malave, it does appear likely that it will intensify a little bit or perhaps significantly, perhaps or even rapid intensification as it emerges into the South China Sea, with conditions becoming increasingly favorable for intensification as land interaction ceases. We could be seeing a Category 3 peak intensity of this system, though at the moment the current forecast calls for a high-end Category 2 on the Saffir-Simpson scale, 110 miles per hour. I'm not sure what the JMA is forecasting, but I'd guess they are forecasting a little bit lower in terms of 10-minute sustained winds than what we are currently forecasting.
I think I saw someone question about the tropical wave. I think that we've marked as 20%. Just general opinions on that.
Sure.
It's got a low chance of development if it tries to really spin up, but I mean, right now at least there isn't too much model support on it. We could see some activity in the Caribbean next week, and that's really potentially the next area to keep a larger eye out for.
That is a good observation, absolutely. regarding Malave, its influence, I'd say, is quite large. I'm not sure exactly what the diameter of its wind field is. If someone could pull that up for me, that'd be great. But it does appear that its influence extends all the way throughout the Philippines, north to south. So this is still impacting the Philippines, even though that it's exiting the country still. So this, by West Pacific standards, is this a large typhoon? Maybe. I'd say it's more of a mediocre sized one. What do you guys think?
Definitely not as large as other systems that we've seen this year. Hai Shen's a really good example of what happens when you get a very large typhoon in the basin. But for a system that was really only developing yesterday, it's gained some size as it's crossed the Philippines, is now emerging out in the South China Sea. Definitely not too large by any stretch of the manner. I'll pull up the text graphic really quick in the JTWC to see if I can find the actual wind radius from it. Its maximum extent of tropical storm force winds or gale force winds is 140 nautical miles, or actually 150, I'm sorry. But overall, most quadrants have about 100 to 150 miles wide of gale force winds, which isn't small by any means. If we want to compare it to Delta, which is much more micro-sized, this definitely has size on it, but it isn't anywhere near other systems that we've seen this year in the basin.
That is a interesting thing that is to note, that the system is quite average in size. Regarding the system, however, rainfall threat, it does appear that a majority of the rainfall at this point is offshore, which is a good thing. That doesn't mean that some heavy rainfall amounts could still fall over land, as the system is still impacting the country, so be on the lookout for potential landslides and flash flooding. And if you do see a flash flood headed your way, or if there is any watches or warnings issued, please do heed them and evacuate or do whatever is necessary to ensure your survival, given that Malave is still in the vicinity of the country. Right now, we have some Signal 3 warnings in effect for the Philippines, and I'm sure that our team would like to go over those. Christian, what are you seeing on the latest Pigasa signals?
Oh, one moment. I'm on the wrong window here. Right. So I'm seeing signal 1 warnings, as far north as if it wants to let me zoom in even further than that. Thanks, Windows. As far north as Aurora. I'm sure you can see my mouse coverage here. And then as far south as, I'm gonna butcher this pronunciation. I want to say Antique. Then you've got Signal 2 warnings in effect as well. Are they down as? I can't see that from here. I have a terrible eyesight. But basically, this area. I'm not sure. Is my mouse even on this?
I can help if you like.
Yes, please do help, Nathan. Thank you very much.
So first of all, the Signal 3 warnings, which are the highest of the lot there so far in the orange. That's for most of the island of Mindoro, also for most of Batangas there as well. Signal 2 extending northwards through to the border between Quezon and Aurora. Also on the western coast of Luzon, as far north as Bataan, which means that Metro Manila is in Signal 2 still at this point. Also, the Calamian group of islands under Signal 2 and northern parts of Romblon, despite them being rather small, it's still been separated there, Signal 2 warnings. And as you correctly said just before, Signal 1 halfway through Aurora province, halfway through Zambales on the western coast, and the very north of Palawan, and part of the island of Panay.
So how often does Pigasa update their warning signals?
I think they're every 3 hours right now.
So, based on this storm's current movement, and given that it is exiting the Philippines now, would I be correct to say that they might discontinue the Signal 3 warnings at the next update?
It'll be close. but it's certainly conceivable that all warnings for the Philippines could be discontinued by the end of the day.
All of them. Interesting.
Maybe.
Do we think that Typhoon Malave will strengthen after leaving the Philippines? Yes. As you just saw in the bottom bar, we are indeed giving large intensity provocations for this storm, and we are giving, last I recall, a 45% chance, 50% there, of a Category 3 peak for Sawdell as it pushes off towards Vietnam. So perhaps a Category 3 peak on the way. What are our team's thoughts on that Category 3 peak?
It's definitely possible with the conditions laid out in front of it, and it's kept its core mostly intact despite crossing some of the more mountainous islands in the Philippines. But, I mean, if you take a look at the satellite imagery, it's definitely struggled a bit more since crossing Mindoro, and isn't quite as impressive now on satellite appearance as it was before crossing the region. So it's going to have to at least spend a tiny bit of time reconsolidating a bit. But it is still very likely that you'll see some significant intensification from this system in the next 2 days.
It did look very concerning when it was first crossing over Mindoro. You could see the ice still very much intact. Right now, it's hard to say, but I'm still on the side of it's going to intensify significantly in the South China Sea and probably get to Category 3 status. Climatologically speaking, exceedingly unlikely that it will beat Category 3 status. I don't think any storm has done it from this position before striking Vietnam. So I'd pretty much rule out a Category 4, but stranger things have happened.
Yeah, I agree with that. Passing over the Philippines definitely isn't like the best situation for a system. But yeah, it's really something that we'll have to keep just a continuous eye on.
Absolutely. You did see up on my screen there briefly, I'll pull it back up here, is the Japan Meteorological Agency's track. They are using 10-minute sustained winds. I'm just going to refresh here to get their updated track by the looks of it. There it is. They are actually now calling for dissipation over Vietnam. The cone before did have a 5-day point. It now only has a 4-day point. However, they are currently giving it a typhoon with 10-minute sustained winds of 65 knots. That's 75 miles per hour. Not entirely sure what that is in kilometers per hour. I'm sure someone can help me out there. But they are forecasting
about 120.
120 kilometers per hour, thank you. They are forecasting intensification up to 80 knots, which is 90 miles per hour, 10-minute sustained winds. In the middle of the South China Sea, and then slight weakening as it approaches Vietnam. But the key thing here, regarding the JMA's forecast, as well as the GTWC's, which we'll get to here in a moment, is that this system will likely strike Vietnam as a typhoon. And pulling up the Joint Typhoon Warning Center's forecast here, they are forecasting a peak of 95 knots, which is 110 miles per hour, which I'd say is a little bit low, given that the storm has been looking quite decent in the last few frames. But it's really unsure if it's going to reach Category 3 intensity, but I'd say Category 2 is pretty much guaranteed.
Yeah, I mean, it's looking that way. A Category 2, I'd say, is nearly a guarantee at this point. The storm's core has survived. I'm thinking that we'll probably get a new burst of convection near the center at some point soon. And when that does happen, we will really begin to see this significant intensification begin. So I'd anticipate that to happen within the next 3 to 6 hours or so. After that, it's off to the races for the next day or so before conditions do get worse for it. But I think that the realistic ceiling for this storm, probably around 120 miles per hour. But I definitely could see this becoming a Category 3 typhoon. And it's definitely something to watch. If I were in Vietnam right now, I'd be preparing as if a Category 3 were going to be knocking on your doorstep. Odds are that's not going to be what you'll experience. A Category 1 or 2 is most likely, but as we said in our previous segment with the Atlantic stuff, it's always better to be more prepared than not prepared enough.
Now, what are we forecasting rainfall-wise? Jacob, do you have any comment on that?
Well, definitely heavy rainfall could continue to fall in the western Philippines where there are still signal 1, 2, and 3 warnings. So you still can't say there won't be any significant rain. You still have to watch out. And in Vietnam, heavy rainfall, not as much in the Philippines, is what is likely, but still heavy rain that may.
That is a interesting thought. And currently on my screen, I've got the estimated rainfall so far for Malave as it pushes through the Philippines. Now, what you're really looking forward, if you want to, looking for, I should say, at the more heavier rainfall spots, you're literally looking at the purples and the blacks. That's where your heaviest rainfall is going to be. And as the storm passed over the Philippines, a lot of it was over land. But it does appear now that a lot of it, a vast majority of the heavier rainfall, is over water, which is a really good thing, given that the storm
I should just
is
say,
so close.
Ethan, the fact that you're still seeing purples and blacks on that particular imagery is quite impressive for this storm. I imagine rainfall totals through its path, especially on the northeastern side, have been quite massive.
Indeed. We just had a question that has come through to us here. What are the reasonable, best, most expected, and worst case scenarios for Epsilon, Malave, and Zeta?
For Epsilon, I think it's it becoming extratropical. That's certain. And then it mixing with the other low pressure system and becoming extremely powerful extratropical, and then going into Ireland with that strength. I think is the worst for Epsilon.
Yeah, the worst case for Epsilon is for some reason, after it merges with this post-tropical low and rapidly deepens again, that if for some reason it doesn't stall and do this cyclonic loop that's forecast, and would instead move towards Iceland or Ireland directly while closer to that intensity. I mean, fortunately, despite Epsilon's deepening and strengthening expected during its post-tropical phase, because it's forecast to have those worst conditions well offshore, it's going to be more of a shipping hazard than a land hazard as the realistic expectation there.
Absolutely. Thomas, what are your thoughts on that question?
I guess I can go through all three storms real quick. With Epsilon, the best case scenario is that the storm doesn't rapidly deepen as it heads northward. The best reasonable case scenario for it would be that this other low just completely absorbs it and it gets nowhere near as deep as expected, 950s and millibars, and the Fujiwara just basically sucks the energy out of it. You get a relatively weak cyclone. When it comes to what's probably expected, 930 millibar-ish low with some hurricane force winds on the southern side over water, tropical storm force winds for Ireland and Iceland. In the worst case scenario, being a sub 900 millibar crazy extratropical cyclone, which was seen on some ensembles. I'd say that's on the outer fringes of the realms of possibility, but I'm not going to call it impossible. With Malave, I'd say the best case scenario is that the core has been disrupted enough that we're going to see a mid-range to high-end Category 1 remain for the next couple of days and then have a tropical storm landfall in Vietnam. The expectations probably will see a Category 3 maximum sustained storm over the South China Sea that's going to hit Vietnam probably as a Category 2, high in Category 1, low in Category 2. And then the worst case scenario is that this strengthens up to a high-end Cat 3, low-end Cat 4, makes landfall as a major typhoon in Vietnam. And when it comes to Zeta, I think the best case scenario is that it doesn't get its act together. You get a tropical storm landfall in the Yucatan, land interaction disrupts the core a lot. You have a 45-mile-an-hour storm in the Gulf of Mexico. It's sheared apart. You barely have a tropical cyclone by the time it gets to the Gulf Coast. Expectations, a Category 1 hurricane, maybe Category 2 hurricane landfall in the Yucatan Peninsula. It's going to move northward, probably hit the United States as a borderline hurricane. And the worst case scenario, Zeta becomes a Cat 3 or 4 before hitting the Yucatan and is a Category 1 or 2 hurricane by the time it gets to the Gulf Coast.
That is a good observation regarding all of those systems.
I really hope that that's
Certainly comprehensive.
If you do have any comments or questions, please do continue to send them in. Now, we will be ending commentary here at the top of this hour. However, I just have a question to the team here. I know that typically the ATCF does update around this time. So has the ATCF updated for any of the systems around the globe? Not sure if anyone can pull that up.
It's updated for 99W, and that's it right now, at least I think from what I'm seeing.
Yep, that's it.
So we don't have the 0Z ATCF updates yet, which will give an indication of in particular, Western Pacific storm intensities that they're going to go with at their next full advisories from the Joint Typhoon Warning Center.
Now, something interesting I know that you just had there, Thomas, was the track forecast for 99W. Do you want to go over those for a second?
Yeah, this is really interesting in my opinion. It's very clearly the ensembles don't really know where the center is, which is completely reasonable considering the fact that, no one knows where the center is going to be. But where the center forms is going to be significant. You can see on the southern side of things a relatively weaker pack of ensembles. We see those yellows and greens there. That's anywhere from 1,005 to 990 millibars-ish. And when you get to the very northern fringes, you have sub-930 millibar monster typhoons. So it looks like the farther to the south and west the storm is, the better the news is going to be when it comes to intensity, because you can see a pretty direct correlation here as you go down with how far north the system is ultimately and how strong it manages to get. So that's something that I find really interesting, but I don't think we're really going to know about this storm and whether it's going to develop in the first place until about a day or two from now, when we really get to see if that's a well-defined center of circulation.
We do indeed have the ATCF update for Zeta, shockingly. The ATCF reports that it has intensified. Winds are now, based on the ATCF, this is not official, of 60 miles per hour and a pressure of 997 millibars. We'll have to see if they get a hurricane center. Go ahead, Nelson.
Oh, that was neat. And I think that's quite interesting that they went with 60 miles per hour, which is a little bit more of a jump than I would have expected at this time. I mean, considering it has intensified quite, I would say. So, but it's still, I don't know, kind of interesting.
Well, I mean, based on the satellite imagery that we're seeing since the stream started, so even the past couple hours, we've seen the actual core convection, even though it's mostly south of the center of the system, the northern semicircle still doesn't have as much deep outflows. The south side, it's much more organized in general. You don't just have a random blob that you would more typically associate with a shear tropical cyclone. You see it beginning to organize in a fashion as if it's ready to wrap around more. And even though 50 miles an hour to 60 miles an hour is a 10 mile an hour jump, it is also important to keep in mind that 55 miles an hour doesn't really exist because it's a 5-knot difference and they round to the nearest 5 miles an hour at that point.
That's fair then, yeah.
Indeed, and as these ATCF updates come out, we will indeed keep you informed. Now, Thomas, I see that you've got some imagery on Zeta. I'm sure that we can go over satellite imagery of Zeta real quick. What's your thoughts on that?
I don't like what I'm seeing at all. Huge convective bursts, minus 90s all over the place. This is not what I'm wanting to see at all. I mean, it literally looks like popcorn blowing up here right now. I don't like the look of that. I don't like it that Recon earlier today had the center moving southeast, which means that we've probably got a nearly stacked center at this point. I don't like it that, it looks like the center is now probably wrapped in minus 70s and 80s. I don't like it that the ACTF has gone up in intensity. What I'm thinking right now is that this storm is gearing up to rapidly intensify, and I think that the next recon mission is going to have some findings we don't like. I hope I'm wrong, but right now I'm seeing signs that this storm is about to intensify to a significant extent.
So, realistically, what do you think is the ceiling for this storm?
I think when you talk about the ceiling, I mean, the ceiling is high.
Don't ask that question. Caribbean
highest.
Sea. Name
I
your
mean-
intensity.
I mean, if this thing has about a day and a half now before land interaction starts to inhibit it, so I'd say solid 140 mile an hour Cat 4 is the ceiling. If I made a forecast right now, I'd probably forecast a 100 mile an hour Cat 2. But that again could be conservative. I mean, the ceiling for this is really high, despite how little time it has, just because it's in the Caribbean Sea.
Yeah,
So,
and just to note as well, just for the time frame as well, it looks like it's really going to have closer to less than 30 hours from right now. So at most, it's going to have 30. It looks closer to 24 hours from this point before it has some more significant land interaction. So if there's any short side on that, it's going to be it doesn't have a lot of time before land interaction is really going to pick up with that upcoming landfall.
something interesting that has just occurred is the ATCF has updated for Malave. The estimate before this recent update was 85 miles per hour, 980 millibars. That's what the Joint Typhoon Warning Center ran with at their latest warning. However, this update, the winds have remained the same at 85 miles per hour. However, the pressure is down to 967 millibars, so that does indicate that this system is still intensifying and could be on the way to rapid intensification.
I'd advise a lot of caution on that because 967 is the default pressure for that wind speed.
Okay, then that by my guess would probably be an automated
Yes.
intensity input, and the JTWC are probably reviewing that estimate right now if I had a safe bet on that. We'll be
I would
ending
agree with that.
coverage just in a few minutes, but I just want to thank my team personally for attending this live coverage with me. And go ahead.
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate that.
No problem.
Thank you for bringing me on.
No problem. Just reinstating the latest on everything around the world. Molave is an intensifying storm headed for Vietnam, probably going to make landfall as a typhoon. Zeta, a hurricane threat to the Yucatan Peninsula and the U.S. Gulf Coast. And Epsilon is on its way out to sea. That's all for us from here at Force 13. We are ending our coverage here. Good night, and stay safe under Typhoon Malave's wrath.